Then with DevJam, he has created software for digital audio, digital biometrics, medical, financial, retail, and education. He is a senior consultant with DevJam, and for the past 10 years, he's coached Agile teams internationally. David contributes to the international Agile community in books, curricula, and at conferences, as well as helping to create Agile curriculum for the University of Minnesota and Capella University. He's a great friend, and we're a big fan here at VersionOne of David, and we're very lucky to have him give his presentation on managing agility. Is this an oxymoron? I'd like to hand it over to David now.
Okay, thanks, MH. If for some reason things don't come up the way we need to, MH, I'm just going to ask you to jump in. I can see the chat, but I can't see the questions, so maybe if those come up as we go, you can fire those to me, or if people are asking this. I always ask people in these webinars to ask questions. Post them, don't wait, don't worry, put them out there. That helps people like me kind of make sure I'm actually communicating something meaningful to you guys. Some talk about, Agile moving into the mainstream and transitioning, and I thought there's a lot of topics to talk about, but I wanted to talk about the collisions I see sometimes in the space of management. And this isn't a new topic. It's gotten better over the years, but it's an interesting rise as the Agile space grows with more and more people adopting, especially larger organizations. I find myself speaking to PMI groups and being invited to speak to those groups and wanting to make sure I'm not the Agile guy that shows up and gives off the message, we don't need you managers. At the same time, I want to kind of challenge people to say, what is this thing managing? And how is it changing? How is it changing forward, and how is it changing relative to the rise of the Agile movement? How needs of this list of not to impress anyone, but instead to say each one of these orgs is very different in domain. And I've worked with most in these different groups as Agile started kind of taking hold and showing success, or in some cases just becoming popular, and trying to work with the PMOs to what are their concerns, and so that's some of the stuff I want to go through in the 40 minutes. I also wanted to go and chat about things a little bit. So MH just told me I'm cutting out a little bit, hopefully problematic. To you guys is a general, and I'm going to have 3 questions to start with. I'm just going to throw this one up, and I want to cut over and spend a few of my minutes having Guild and me give you a demo. And so I'll set this up for you. This is the World Science Festival, and this Bobby McFerrin, and he's on stage with a group of neurologists. And so I'm just going to play this for you. It's about 3 minutes long. Think about what he's doing, leadership perspective.
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy.
Okay, so that's pretty fascinating, and maybe you've seen that before, maybe you haven't, but I asked the question, so let's think about, so you is, but he's a skilled singer, artist, genius in residence in many locations, but ask yourself right now, just pause for a second and say, work. What did he just do there? Why did it work? Because there's a lot of really interesting aspects of that have to do with managing and leading. So one reason it works is because of who he is. After I showed that to someone the first time, I met with a friend who knows Bobby, and I asked him that question. He said it works because of who Bobby is. He said, well, it's not the first time he's done it, which I thought was a really interesting comment, meaning he has the skills. And he also said the first time he did it, it probably didn't work. So he has the experience. So there is definitely a part of who that person is, just like there are leaders at organizations, and the Agile community hope to finish that. The other piece, though, is maybe more in the process stage. If you look at what he did, he took a large, didn't ask any questions, and got them all to sing, sang over the top. Then he sang a harmony note with them. He got them to extrapolate, and they actually sang an entire scale in octaves of a pentatonic scale. That's an amazing thing he did, and no one took a skills and knowledge that those people had. He pentatonic scale. It works in many places in the world. In fact, I know how to sing that. They've done it and they don't know it. Any simple states. He also provided some leadership. He showed them what to do. He injected some humor. He started simple. He showed them they could do that, and then he incrementally started adding things into it and let them take over. And I think that's at the essence of the kind of leadership and management that I see happening in the Agile space. So that's a weird way for us to get started, because my next question to you is this, is like, what is 21st century management? How does it not relate to what I just showed you? So feel free to jot these things down. Answer this question for yourself. Answer the question, are managers leading? If so, how? Make a couple notes. Post some questions to the group. What's 21st century management? Well, I would say that I think he exhibited a lot of it. I think some of the things haven't changed, others have. Is that the places where I see people being successful, agile, schmagile, are the set up ecosystems for learning, where we need to be able to learn, because that's our best way to adapt, either adapting in technology, adapting in needs, adapting in the social dynamics of working in a global environment. So then Agile methods and make them powerful tools for managers and leaders, as opposed to things that feel possibly uncomfortable or challenging, is how are those Agile methods helpful for those things? And I wanted to start with that example and these three questions to seed the rest of this conversation, to say, I think those things are meaningful. I think Agile methods are meaningful to deal with some of the adversities that are coming up. And I'm wondering why we're still often caught in the under the bus, and managers are ready to say, well, those developers doesn't seem to be helpful. And so if you reframe, excuse me, the Agile and call them that, a set of tools, then you start asking what you're doing. What value of the Agile methods you're using? And as a joke, a while ago I created my own way to help people with this, which has been interesting kind of with leaders and managers and such, and because I think that sometimes some of the leaders in leadership see Agile methods they can become just another process, or they can become a set of tools called Dude's Law as a way to say, how are we getting value out of the mechanics we're using? And when I say mechanics, it's not in any way to rip into Agile methods. It's like, well, if this is the mechanics of doing test-driven, why are you doing it? That feels leadership thinking, whether it's leadership thinking from someone that has a leader in their title, senior management, or leadership thinking from within, a group of people challenging the status quo. So Dude's Law is one of my offerings to try and kind of make connections with these managers to say, yes, there should be a purpose for what. So lead, let's step into the idea of developing agility. And I don't mean just educating people. That's a part of it. People need to understand basic processes. But I want to kind of go a little bit further in where is the value in Agile methods? How are we showing the success? How are we measuring it? Sometimes that's done well. Other times, with some of the critical thinking managers that I'm around, that's not done well, and people are passionately working, but there's not a good communication about all the different value that's there. So I framed it up as myths. And so the first myth that I put up is this idea that teams self-organize. Because I think that there's oftentimes hand-waving in this space where someone says, well, and I don't see that that happens. In fact, I was teaching a course for an organization, and there was the father of the person organizing, and I worked at P&G in the 70s when we brought in Lean, and we called that self-directed. And we found that that was one of the most difficult things for us to produce. I thought that's a nice statement. Now, if we kind of jump back to what Bobby McFerrin just did, he did get that group to self-organize. But part of my question to you is how? How did that? And I'm going to get to that because I think it's on the fact side. I think that what he did is he gave them direction. So self-organizing happens when people are given direction, and the idea of self-organizing the challenges manager is often is with people, when they have that direction, let's get out of the way and try and set up an ecosystem where small failures are celebrated as learning, the same way they are in science. Some of the other myths on here are interesting. Obviously, the still hear, sadly, the managers are evil. One of the ones that I think is interesting is that there seems to be some kind of a movement in this space, like we don't need to know where we're going. We'll figure it out one day or one iteration at a time. And that's always been one of the challenges in the Agile community, is instead of saying we have an idea of where we're going and why, but we're not sure how to get there, and we're using these iterations to deal with the challenges, but going is not the right place anymore. And that's a little bit more rich than saying change happens, even though change happens is true. So if you start tying some of these together, now you start getting some things, managers that care. Is people for a long time have understood that, like, having a common purpose bonds teams. And you can see that in old school ideas like war rooms. Why do people form war rooms? Because they have the same attributes as a lot of the collaborative workspaces we put together. People are focused. There's a prioritized list of work. It's very easy to make connections, and progress is visible. The difference between that and today's team rooms is that they're more like peace labs. I mean, let's set up that same ecosystem without all the stress. That message communicates well to a critically thinking manager or a leader, instead of going to them and saying, we need a team room because that's what Agile is all about. Another one is here, and this is a more subtle one, is that a change is there's a lot of places where people are still trying to learn to estimate. instead of like learning from their estimates. Now, if you have a group of people working in the same technology over the same period of time, better at estimation if you're learning from your estimates, and you might be able to establish some kind of consistency. If you're in right or wrong, or whether you like it or not, where there's some team churn and direction is changing and technology, you're much better off to learn from your estimates. Still not really great when you're a large pile of things, of work, and someone says, how big is it? We're still not very good at that. But we're learning to say, it's the last one I want to see a lot of groups talking to me is when there's multiple teams that need to come together to produce one thing that's of meaning to an organization. A roadmap is an essential tool that often becomes synchronization boundaries across teams. A powerful tool for cross-team, cross-iteration, cross-functionality development that is sometimes not communicated to the people outside of those teams. Each team is an island unto its good is across the teams, whereas maybe those managers, if you will, are looking in and saying, yes, we need all of these groups to be successful. So from there, I want to pop forward to this notion. This is a picture, this is one of the reasons I like VersionOne, is that this is the kind of thing that they've produced over the years, and I think it has a lot of things that connect communities instead of separating them between the teams and the managers become part of the team. In fact, leadership can spring up in all aspects of the team. One of those things is buried right here, and it's this little word called governance that I think scares some people in the Agile community because they see governance and they think some phrase that they've heard too many times like command and control. And governance could be reframed as, investment. Where is my investment going if I'm investing in something? If you're investing in something directly and your investment is not going in a positive direction, you are probably concerned about that. And I would ask, why should anyone that's maybe down here in the trenches, banging out, working hard on the iterations, not care about that investment? Now that doesn't say that governance in every case is not, meaningless or that it's not meaningful, because there are situations where I walk into where the governance is self-induced and not necessarily helpful. In fact, you could frame that governance question into, I've been looking at a lot of things with kind of through the simple lens of the theory of constraints, saying, well, there's three buckets. There's things, there's unmovable constraints, there's movable constraints, and there's self-induced constraints. And these you can do something about. These you might not be able to do something about. So self-induced constraints in governance can be painful, but unmovable constraints like the FDA, if you're in that space, force you to say, how can we actually prove that we're testing things? The other thing I think is meaningful in this picture, or I use this picture a lot to make connections with managers, to make connections with leaders, to say, you know what, these tools down here are powerful. They are actually the fundamentals that give you real business agility. These tools up here are for setting direction and kind of understanding investment or something like that. I guess funding over here would be in that same bucket. And being able to tie these two together is something you've never been able to do. The data that you needed to do that. And so later we're going to kind of talk about this idea of burn-up from how I hear a lot of managers look at it as something of like, a nouveau earned value. The second piece, though, if this is kind of more about how those people are learning, how teams those people to these people, another aspect of leadership is this notion of change. And this is another thing that I see from some of the sharper leaders that I'm working with is they're saying change isn't free. So what change is helpful? Which change is meaningful? Which change takes me from the current status quo to a new status quo because I'm going to make an investment in it? And this is a picture that someone created a long time ago. You see it pop up in the Agile community a lot. It's a fundamental tool that I use when I'm talking with people about why, what value are we getting, is I'll say, well, what is a practice? Let's take a few practices. Test-driven, user stories, iterations for that matter, sprints, if you will, and say, where are you on this curve with this? Sitting with maybe possibly a manager who's frustrated. I don't understand how this stuff is helpful. I don't know if test-driven is meaningful. I would say, well, where do you think you are with test-driven? Do people dislike it? Are they trying it, but it doesn't feel right? Are you in a space where someone has figured out, oh, test-driven is actually more about design and the tests are a neat byproduct? Or have you got to the point where people trust those tests so much you are now able to move quite a bit faster? And I think that's just what I'm trying to show is different ways that I'm trying to connect the value of the tools to the people that are maybe looking from the outside in, because what I see now is that more teams are ready to embrace test-driven than they used to be. 10 years ago, that was kind of a crazy thing for a lot of groups, but we're still not doing a good job communicating the value of it out. This is another one that we don't do a good job communicating the value of. And one of the things I always challenge people with that's really good in the management space is I'm with a developer and that person's telling me, well, no one will let me refactor. And I say to them, if I buy you 10% of your next iteration for refactoring, how are you going to spend it? Because it challenges them to start saying, what's the most meaningful refactoring? Now you're starting a discussion with the investors, if, for instance, the management group is the investor. So on a larger level, taking those ideas forward, what is 21st century management? Well, part of it's about learning. Learning is about teaching, but allowing people to kind of have small controlled failures that produce more value over time through learning and finding the right set of practices. Why are you doing this becomes that question that's always there. And I think, again, the leadership groups that I'm working with, I find myself when I'm talking to like the PMI community about this, this is a powerful question. It's like, what is the outcome that you expect? And so I'm going to look at it from three perspectives. This is three ways that I try and communicate to people why I think Agile methods are valuable. So the first one is it answers the question for me, if I'm in a leadership role, are we building the right thing? Which we're going to get to, are we actually getting it built, and are we building it the right way? Are we building the right thing? And so this is a set of tools that I think are really powerful in trying to surface that. Some of them are new, some of them are reworked, but it's moving from a requirements-based thinking to user-centered, which I think is more outcome-based. What do we want people's experience to be when they use our product? Whether it's a shrink-wrapped DVD or a web service or an internet-based solution. And this picture, often called the story map, has more than the story map, but it has all the components I think you need. It has this. Who's trying to do what? What are they trying to accomplish? And down here, this shows how. So people always say, well, are those user stories? And yes, in some ways, the whole thing is one large user story called the story map. Jeff Patton is the one who kind of coined that term. But it gives me the context, and I think it gives a lot of people that are truly interested in making meaningful investments. And so we're not talking about the managers and leaders that just start up projects and check out, to say, who's getting value out of this thing? Hopefully that's the discussion you're having before you're investing. What are they trying to accomplish, or what are we giving them? And then how? And so these are kind of more, this is more of a user story that might go into an iteration, or maybe this one might. This is another tool to kind of say, well, what is it going to look like for them? And so in this one view, I can bring in a lot of perspective. I can bring in a testing person. I can bring in a development person. I can bring in manager or an investor. And we all have the context of like who, what, and how, and possibly the UI. That starts driving a much better discussion about, are we going to build the right thing, because we're not running away from who's going to use it. It's not just a requirement that we later put in front of someone. We're trying to introduce that up front. The second way that I'm trying to communicate this stuff, the second question I use as outcome-based thinking when I'm trying to kind of connect management groups into the development space is, are we building it the right way? Now this is an interesting delineator at certain organizations, because at some companies, the people that are in leadership roles have no idea how to answer this question. Good or bad is debatable. At other companies, the people in leadership roles have direct understanding of how to answer this question, which also can be good or bad. But there has to be some balance between building the right thing the right way. And so I put up a couple of indicators that show, that are easily produced once you have things like continuous integration, and maybe many people on the phone are already using a tool like Sonar, which tells you a couple different things. It tells you kind of the amount of tests that you have and some level of complexity inside the code, because that still matters. Fred Brooks once, I think, used a term called accidental complexity to describe code issues that are injected in by people because they're unaware that they're doing it. Accidental complexity inhibits business agility directly. It's not always something people can surface. Agile methods are starting to do this. This is a perfect example, because having a lot of tests is good unless you just have a lot of tests to try and mask the amount of complexity that you have. Trying to be able to compare those two is maybe what we could call like a metrics mashup. And that's why tools like Sonar are starting to answer some of those questions faster. We don't have to guess at this complexity. We can start measuring some of that. Now, you may or may not believe in this specific metric, but this is a simple way to quickly find out, to map quantity and quality. And one of the pictures I often find myself drawing for people is to say, across time, where this is time and this is quantity, if this line here represents the amount that we're completing, and suddenly it starts skyrocketing. But this line represents, so this is cumulative story points, and this line represents the amount of testing automation that we have. This is all manual. This whole window right here is all the manual testing we have to do to release something. And that is a debt. And now for the first time we can see that debt. That's an easy thing. And so it gives more visibility, and no one has to be the police, which in some cases I've seen that that's what a manager has to do, especially if they're from a technical background. So making connections, are we building the right thing? Are we building it the right way? And maybe, are we producing it in a timely fashion? Are we competitive? So if we go back to this picture, this is a nice tool now to start mapping it to progress, because this map stays whole and speaks to the product, but these little work units get pulled over here into this queue, and it runs into this not started, in the current iteration, in progress, and completed. So these are those small little work units. This whole thing shows the larger value. This over here shows progress, and that's a very powerful combination, very common to Agile communities that starts kind of answering this last question, which I think is something we've been asking for a long time. Another way to look at it is a different variation on that picture I drew a few minutes ago. So often called a burn-up chart. Again, quantity and time here. What's interesting to me is that I've been kind of thinking about the Agile space as an idea of discovery. What is this thing we're building? And delivery. How much of it can we produce? And when I stumbled into using VersionOne, they had this like trend chart. And while burn down charts were working well, in some situations they weren't working well for me because we could see that this was our ideal path. But somehow along the way when we started taking measurements, we really didn't know what was going on in here. And a simple modification to that chart, not rocket science, was to say, well, let's have a line that shows how much we're trying to get done, and we can extrapolate that line out. But let's have a different produced. So now we're rolling along on the end of our first iteration or first day or what. Things are going well, and we're getting more done, and then somewhere out of nowhere, yikes, we're still going at about the same rate, but this line bops up. This is easily described as discovery, and this is easily described as delivery. And you might say, oh no, this is bad. Well, that is bad, right, if these two lines trend so that they're not coming together. But in a lot of organizations, this is a nice discussion starter. This is how much we've produced. This is how much we've discovered. Well, where did that discovery come from? Is it really an indicator that we decided we should go in a different direction and we haven't made that decision? Is it telling us that there's some constraint that's driving our estimates up? Did we underestimate things? This line could also go down. It's just that it seems very simple, but having these two tends to start the discussions that are more rich, the discussions that when I'm in a leadership position, I want people to have. How much have we produced? How much have we discovered? Because the delta between those two, for me, is where learning happens. That's that picture I want to look at over time. And in the end, that's a good example of one of many shifts that I think that are out there. And I wanted to try and kind of pull this together. It's a pretty big topic to try and put into 40 minutes with some of the big shifts that I see. Because if we're talking about moving more into leadership and leaders instead of the manager that's dictating, how do we do some of those things? Hand-waving and saying self-organizing.
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy.
And you can quantify these if you want to. But here's a couple examples. I think in the last millennia we said what's required. And then we stood around and talked for hours about what was actually required. And I think we're starting to say, well, if we want to produce more with less, let's figure out what's needed. Let's figure out if we should just rebuild that system or if a lot of what we've done is not meaningful. These are all points that I think methods without getting into who plays what role or what processes we're using. Like, these are things that are helpful to us. How many hours did we work versus how much did we produce? Now that one challenges some traditional leadership notions. And I guess the discussion I end up having with those people is more out, which sometimes is the end of the discussion. Or some people think it is. Well, let's measure it. How much are you producing? Or how much cost? Now this really challenges people because there's a lot of people that are still doing cost-only planning versus how much opportunity. I could have put profit over here, but I didn't because I work in some situations where it's not just about profit. Profit's an aspect, but making investments in opportunities to show that those are later meaningful is another way to look at it, or the opportunity could be saving lives, which could be profitable. Another shift that's subtle that I mentioned before is instead of saying, well, I think it's about this big. Someone came to us 15 years ago with a pile of requirements. We said, well, we think we'll have it done in a year and a half after we looked at it for 3 months. Is we're starting to kind of use the same ideas that other people use. Big problems are solved by breaking them down into a series of small problems. Those don't have to be small things that can be done in a day, because that's usually more meaningful to a team and an iteration as a tool to say, here's a flow control metric for us. I'm kind of thinking from a managerial perspective or a leadership perspective to say, let's bust them out so we can kind of have an idea of where we're going across a quarter or a half a year, something that might fit more with the company's funding cycle. And I mentioned this one before, so I'm going to jump ahead to these last ones. And you see I kind of covered some of the big items like estimation and cost. And down here is technology or architecture. And so I think the challenges we used, or the changes we used to build for the future, and now we're assuming that the future at some point ends. You can build for 6 months or a year or 3 years or 5 years, but at some point you're going to either have to sunset a system or have it adapt. And so now we're starting to say, assume that we need to adapt early. That is a technology perspective that feeds business agility. Some of the more subtle ones that some managers don't see is this notion of, like, instead of one person showing another person their code, they start talking in tests. And if people just could use that simple guide, this is a tool I've used with some managers who say to me, well, I'm not technical, so I don't understand what's going on this XP project. I would say, well, listen to see if the developers are explaining things to each other in tests. Because when people start talking in tests and they stop reverse engineering code on the fly, when I walk over to someone else's desk and I say, he says, can you help me with this? And my first question, my first request is, can you show me the code? To figure out the intent, if the first thing he shows me is a test, I can move faster because I understand what he's trying to accomplish. It's like an experiment. And the last one is more controversial. It's like maybe instead of planning to integrate, we've moved to continuous integration, and now there's an emergence of this idea of continuous deployment. Now that takes an enormous amount of skill, returning to Bobby McFerrin. You don't just do continuous deployment. It takes skill and discipline from the development and the building organization and the testing group, that delivery team, if you will, to say, we've automated everything from the point of saying, let's push a button, we wipe all the code, we rebuild it all, we run a set of tests, and we deploy it into a production space. And there's not a lot of people doing it. And some people can't do it. Obviously, if you're doing medical devices, it probably doesn't make sense. But if you're in a web delivery space, it's an excellent option, and I would say you can do it. You just haven't started making that investment. As the power of continuous deployment grows, you're going to see more and more folks using that. So that was kind of a weird jam, and I think we're through the 40 minutes, so I'm going to ask MH to come back here and see if we can address some of questions, if there are any.
There are. I'll go ahead and read you the first one. It's a long one. So what are you leading? How are you leading? Consider coach horse system. Who is leading? What and how?
What are you leading? How are you leading? Okay, so from my perspective, the what is about the production of something meaningful. I use the term product. I think some people get fairly hung up on that. It doesn't have to necessarily be a thing that someone interacts with directly. It could be a calculation engine. But there is this thing that you're producing. And so I think of, coaching as producing. I used to produce music, and so the thing I was leading in that situation was a group of people to end up producing a piece of music. I wasn't playing the music for them, but I made comments on the music. How am I doing it is, A, being respectful of what skills I have and what skills I don't have. So if I'm in a situation where I don't know something about some technology, I don't pretend that I do. I have a programming background, so I think it's easier for me to try and sniff out things that seem odd in that space. I guess concretely what I do is go into an organization and do some kind of a simple assessment of where they are, how they work today, what works for them, what doesn't, why they want to change, and what value they're looking for. That's the first thing. The second thing would be to put together some kind of a coaching plan. Like, what are we going to introduce where, and how are we going to know it's valuable? An example would be, one end of the continuum would be we're greenfielding a project with 6 people that all get along, and we think we can introduce quite a few practices because we have this one person who can do a great job as the product owner or the customer. At the other end of the continuum would be a team that's distributed around 5 countries, and they're split where the business group is in one country, the The testing group is another country, and the development group is in yet another country. I'm less likely to introduce a lot of change into that space because I want to show value early. That's kind of how I would go about that. Who's leading is a brilliant question, because I'm a little bit fearful sometimes that we're going to turn the Agile coach into the next. We have the potential to have Agile coaches become the next round of bad managers. And that's, so I'm not throwing managers under the bus. I'm saying managers aren't bad, bad managers are bad. I've seen in some organizations where somehow this coaching role just became yesterday's management, and the notion of leadership growing inside a team, or self-organizing, if you will, hasn't happened because the team is still a bunch of sheep. And I have a friend that says if you fence people in, they'll become sheep. And I think it's, you know, opening the cage, if that's the space you're in, and trying to foster small little bits of leadership where people can kind of take ownership. Having different people lead things like stand-up meetings or retrospectives or planning or technology discussions. That's an example. So I don't know who asked the question. If I didn't answer all of it, you can chime in again. MH, are there other questions?
There are. This question, I'm trying to set the context, but what prevented measuring this, in quotes, in the, quote, last times?
Yeah, so I think what the person was saying is I wasn't, you know, I put these measures up at the end here, and I was kind of saying these are some of the shifts, so that this. I think a lot of it has to do with work units and frequency. For years and years, I've just kind of been distilling down what we do in the Agile space as working on small testable things in fixed cycles is initially a great way to learn. So the difference between a retrospective and a post-mortem is oftentimes the cycle time. Once you get fairly good at learning and getting those work units to be kind of consistent, then the cycles, the fixed cycles, become less meaningful. But early on, for a lot of groups, that's a lot of it. It's done means something, and when you can actually put something in front of a user, that's your best measure. Things are done when people use them, not when you sign off a story in an iteration. And we're able to produce more in less time, but often due to technology. I mean, relative to C++ projects in the late 80s, relative to a Rails project today, that frequency has been wildly diminished. Other questions?
Okay, as part of the measurement of success, do you see the Net Promoter Score becoming a bigger driver?
It certainly is popular. I guess I would apply Dude's Law to it and say, you know, what are you trying to accomplish from that? I think it's helpful in some situations. I think it's trendy in others. That doesn't mean it's bad. It just is certainly wildly popular right now. I don't know why this is, but I don't find myself running to use it often. And I don't, I'll just leave it with that. That could be my issue. Other questions?
That was our last of our questions. Does anyone else have any questions for David? All righty. Well, thank you so much, everyone, especially David, for giving us such an incredible speech and talk. And if anyone has any questions, the presentation will be available following this presentation. Feel free to reach out to us, and we look forward to working with you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much.